Hello and welcome to my third part of Mayor of Casterbridge, chapter number 11. So far, we have seen Michael Henchard very much exasperated and very much overjoyed by seeing his lost daughter, and of the fact that he is almost about to meet his wife. He finally decides to meet his wife Susan at a very secluded place, chapter number 11. This place is an old Roman settlement. Roman, not settlement, it's an amphitheater. It's called Ring in Dorset, where he proposes to meet his wife. Now, Dorset was a Roman settlement once upon a time, so this is a finely chosen place by Henchard, actually in secrecy, to meet his lost wife. Now, if I can read the opening section of this wonderfully written by the author. The Ring at Casterbridge was merely a local name of one of the finest Roman amphitheaters, if not the very finest remaining in Britain. Casterbridge announced old Rome in every street, alley and precinct. It looked Roman, bespoke the art of Rome, concealed dead men of Rome. It was impossible to dig more than a foot or two deep about the two town fields and gardens without coming upon some tall soldier or other of the empire, who had lain there in his silent and obtrusive rest for a space of 1500 years. And there are many more lines. So this place has deliberately been chosen by Michael Henchard to meet his wife, where he can put forward the proposal of a remarriage, and thus he can retain his lost daughter too. But here we must remember, this is a case of unconscious irony, because Michael Henchard doesn't know that Elizabeth Jane is not the Elizabeth Jane who was his own blood daughter, who was his own biological daughter. The actual daughter of Michael Henchard perished. She couldn't survive her infancy soon after they left Michael Henchard. But anyway, Michael Henchard is very much excited to have met his wife and his daughter. This is a turning point in this novel, and therefore we need to read the chapter very well, and also the portion which is described by the author. I mean, Thomas Hardy is very adept in describing such things like, for instance, the nature. Of course, nature is a strong point of Michael Henchard, of Thomas Hardy. Once again, beg your pardon. But at the same time, he knows how to describe the night, the Roman ruined, dilapidated structure of the Romans in Dorset. Of course, he knew these things quite firsthand, and that is how the chapter is. But in the next chapter, we see there are certain problems with Michael Henchard. Now, we must remember that Michael Henchard, in these in those absent years, was involved with in a love affair, love relationship with a woman called Lucetta, and she was absent all these years. Now, Michael had some intentions to marry Lucetta, but now when he finds his wife and daughter around him, and when he plans to remarry the woman Susan and just set up his household once again, he thinks that it is time to just sever the relationship with Lucetta. It is again another very decisive moment in his life, and therefore he writes a letter to Lucetta, and he also sends a check to just recompense the loss sustained by Lucetta. This is important. So this also shows the grit and determination of this man, Michael Henchard. Now, Susan, living as a widow in Casterbridge before marriage, Susan has been provided for, and Henchard now hires a cottage in Casterbridge for his wife Susan, who begins to live there under the name Mrs. Newson. Mrs. Newson, soon to be Mrs. Henchard. Now, according to the plan formed by Henchard and Susan, Henchard begins to visit her at this cottage, and thus becomes a news that in the neighborhood that Henchard has fallen in love with a middle-aged woman. And in fact, in a sardonic, in a sarcastic way, Susan has also been started being called the ghost, by the local folk. So, after a reasonable span of time, Henchard now, comes with the proposal, and he finally sets the time and place for marriage, and that is how his plan is falling into place, and quite correctly, and quite the way he had thought things. One motive is to make amends to his wife, whom he had treated so badly. This is one reason in Henchard's mind, because Henchard has always been very aware that he wronged his wife years ago. So this is he wants to fix things right now by a remarriage. The second motive is to provide a comfortable home to his daughter Elizabeth Jane. But we must always carry this in our mind, that this is not the same Elizabeth Jane, but this is again something that is unknown to Michael Henchard. The third motive, however, is to punish himself for the past, for the sins that he thinks he committed years ago under a different state of mind. Michael Henchard is a character. There are so many such characters in real life, who love to punish themselves for any wrongs that they have done. This is a kind of purging and self-purification for an individual. So he goes on with this plan. And finally, the remarriage. So it was a day in November. Henchard and Susan arrive at a church, and of course they are also accompanied by a new character in this novel, Farfrae, Donald Farfrae, and the marriage takes place. And so this everything happens quite the way they expected. And Henchard says to Susan, with reference to Farfrae, I have a splendid fellow to superintend my business now. I shall soon be able to leave everything to him. This shows a great confidence of Michael Henchard in Farfrae, and soon we will find out how this confidence crumbles away, because there shall be acrimony and there shall be differences between these two characters. But now Henchard, at least for the time being, is a very happy man. He is reunited with his lost wife, and of course he has found somebody with whom he can leave his business. So everybody is living quite happily. After this marriage, Henchard and Susan are living in the same house. Elizabeth Jane is also living with them. Elizabeth Jane finds that Henchard, who regards as a stepfather, treats her with great kindness and affection. She feels very happy with her new life, but she does not become proud or haughty. This is the character of these characters, Michael Henchard, or even Elizabeth Jane. This is one thing that strikes everybody, that she is very humble and very down to earth. And little by little, we also see how Henchard feels a kind of closeness with his daughter, with his stepdaughter, or the real daughter. He thinks she is real daughter, but she is not. So Henchard proposes that Elizabeth Jane should now be called Miss Elizabeth Jane Henchard instead of Elizabeth Jane Newson, because he insists upon a change of name. But Susan objects to the change of name because Susan knows that Elizabeth Jane is the actual daughter of Newson and not Michael Henchard. Henchard also finds that Elizabeth's hair is brown and not dark as it was in her childhood. Now, this is very interesting, very curious. But Susan tells him that look, this color has changed. The tinge has altered over the years. But the real reason is that this is not the same daughter whom Michael Henchard saw 18 years ago. But the secret remains secret. Susan doesn't divulge that the color has got to be different because this is not the same Elizabeth Jane. Another mystery, quite well guarded. And then we see greater prosperity in Michael Henchard's life. After all, because now his business is being looked after by Farfrae. The corn and hay business owned by Henchard now begins to flourish under the management of a newcomer, a Scotchman, Farfrae. And Farfrae does everything that he can, of course, very systematic manner, which was very much absent during Henchard's time. Henchard was a semi-literate man. In contrast, and Farfrae is very organized. He knows how to keep book. He knows he has a very good understanding of the corn, etc. And it results into a great prosperity, financial prosperity of Michael Henchard. Then we also find out that there is a meeting between Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane. And this meeting was actually organized or engineered by Susan, who leaves 2 letters, 2 notes to both of them. Everybody thinking that the note was actually written by the other person, asking him or her to meet at an appointed place. And they do meet, Elizabeth Jane and Farfrae. Eventually, they discover that these notes were not penned by them, but by somebody else, by some third person who wanted to meet them with each other. But this is how the intimacy develops more and more between Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane. Now, slowly, what do we see? That Farfrae's growing popularity. Farfrae is a man who begins from here onward to rise in his professional career. He is, of course, very adept, very skilled. He's a cool customer. And there happens there is an event in this story. The story involving Abel Whittle, actually a worker on the farm of Michael Henchard, who was punished very unduly, very in a unjustified way by Michael Henchard on a morning, and it was quite unacceptable to Farfrae. And Farfrae said that you must. He told Michael Henchard that you must, rectify yourself. Otherwise, I am going to leave you. I am not going to work under you anymore. He was very furious, Farfrae. So it results. The incident was not intended by people. I think not even by Michael Henchard. But Michael Henchard had that kind of certain fits of his rage, his anger. So this tiny event that involved Abel Whittle contributed to the popularity and more acceptability of Farfrae. And of course, it was not taken in a good light by Michael Henchard. Therefore, Michael Henchard felt quite jealous. This is the beginning of the jealousy that starts brewing in Michael Henchard. Now there is an event, another event, a day of national rejoicing. With the passing of time, Henchard now becomes somewhat reserved with Farfrae because he is also feeling kind of jealous. He's a jealous man, after all. He's he's polite towards Farfrae, but in the heart of his heart, he has some misgivings, some certain some maybe some rivalry for Farfrae. Then there comes a rejoicing, a national event, which was being celebrated everywhere, and Farfrae also makes some arrangements to mark the day. Henchard's spirit of rivalry aroused by Farfrae's taking the initiative. Perhaps he didn't want his manager to take all the initiative, but anyway, Farfrae did, and Henchard therefore decides to put off his own show in order to excel Farfrae. It was a kind of an ego clash. But eventually, by some unknown stroke of fate, things didn't go well for Michael Henchard. Henchard spends a lot of money and makes quite elaborate arrangements for the show at Casterbridge. However, it so happens that Henchard's arrangements break down. Some unexpected weather changes. But Farfrae was also a very clever man. What did he do? He arranged his show under a shelter, and thus his arrangements were spared by the fury of nature. So the consequence was that people flocked to Farfrae's show, and they deserted Henchard's show, and it contributed to Henchard's jealousy and anger, and a subdued anger for Farfrae even more than before. And of course, Henchard is not a very comfortable man, but between this, meanwhile, what happens that Henchard is also upset by a fact that Elizabeth Jane and Farfrae have come very close to each other. He didn't want to. He loved Elizabeth Jane so much because he thought Elizabeth Jane was his own daughter. But at the same time, he didn't like his own manager, Farfrae. So when Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane were showing signs of love for each other, warmth for each other, it certainly didn't go down very well with Michael Henchard, and Michael Henchard didn't certainly approve of such kind of relationship. So eventually, Michael Henchard was left with no other option but to dismiss Farfrae, to fire him, and he showed indications. He was upset, feeling jealous for Farfrae's increasing popularity. Henchard drops a hint to Farfrae that Farfrae's tenure was almost over as a corn manager, and therefore he should leave. And this can indicate at the end of the period that the contract between the two individuals is over. So obviously, Henchard now wants to part with Farfrae. So this is the beginning of a new kind of a new episode in Henchard's life. This rivalry between Henchard and Farfrae that becomes worse and worse in the coming chapters. Now, Farfrae is a man in this story who is very self-conscious and who has got a sense of self-respect. Under the circumstances, therefore, he doesn't want to stay at Casterbridge for a moment. Henchard's attitude towards Farfrae is far worse now, and one day he tells Elizabeth Jane that he will soon be quitting Casterbridge. Farfrae says. He also informs her that there is something he wanted to say to her, but the circumstances have made it absolutely impossible for him. So obviously he wanted to propose the marriage, but he couldn't do it. But Farfrae doesn't stop here. Farfrae doesn't leave Casterbridge, but he settles his own business, and he becomes a successful trader. A man in the corn and hay business, wanted to sell his business, and Farfrae comes forward to buy it. The result is that Farfrae is now an independent corn trader and no more under the wings of Michael Henchard. And this news actually causes a great excitement in Elizabeth Jane. Elizabeth Jane always loved Farfrae. But even having been rebuffed, Henchard's and Farfrae doesn't have much sour feelings for Henchard. When Henchard receives this news about Farfrae, he feels even more offended. He after all cannot stand this fact that Farfrae can open his independent business. He rather considers Farfrae's step as a challenge to himself, and he therefore decides to teach Farfrae a very good lesson. He first resolves that he'll not allow Farfrae's business to flourish in the same area, and secondly, he forbids Elizabeth Jane to be more intimate with Farfrae. And thirdly, he pens a letter to Farfrae directing him to make no attempt whatsoever to meet Elizabeth Jane. Clearly, Michael Henchard is now a very jealous man, and he's boiling in his own anger. But one must remember that even after so many facts and circumstances, Farfrae doesn't change himself. Farfrae, on the other side, feels no hostility towards Henchard. In fact, he takes great care to avoid any kind of business rivalry with Henchard. He even refuses to have any business dealings with those traders who had any dealings or connections with Henchard. And this is how the chapter ends, a very important one, of course. Lucetta's love letters. Lucetta is a former love of Michael Henchard, and Henchard now receives a letter from this woman, Lucetta, to whom he had once given a promise of marriage. They had some kind of very intimate relations, but subsequently, of course, he had written to her explaining the reason why he cannot perhaps settle down with Lucetta, because he has got his lost wife and daughter. But Lucetta has now written one more letter to Henchard, asking him to return to her all those letters, because after all these letters are confidential, and therefore they must not fall into hands of some mischievous man. And in response to this communication, Henchard ties up all Lucetta's letters in a packet. This is going to be very crucial later on in the story. We'll find out. So this happens, and it carries it. Michael Henchard carries the packet to a place which she had fixed for a brief meeting with him. However, Henchard finds no trace of Lucetta, but the packet remains there. Packet remains a very important object to play even more tricks in the coming episodes. Now, here comes one more event which is equally important. Susan's health starts deteriorating. Perhaps that failing health gives her some signs, some convictions to her that she is not going to live long. One day she writes something on a sheet of paper, and she folds the paper and envelopes the paper and seals it. And on the envelope she then writes the following words. Which are the words? To Mr. Henchard, Michael Henchard, not to be opened till Elizabeth Jane's wedding. So the letter should not be seen unless Elizabeth Jane has been married. This is how she uh, writes the letter, and she envelopes the letter, puts the letter into envelope. But there is something very crucial here. Susan doesn't glue the envelope, doesn't seal the envelope quite properly, and that plays a very that plays quite an unexpected role later on. We'll find out. And these are the small things in Hardy's plot structure. He leaves these little rooms, very small rooms of fate or coincidence, whatever you call them. But these coincidences, these accidents, ultimately prove a quite decisive role in a man's character, in a story, in a novel. And finally, Susan, who was suffering from some kind of illness, passes away. And that is the end of Susan. Susan tells Elizabeth that it was her wish that the two of them should get married. I mean, Farfrae and Elizabeth. And then a few days later, Susan dies. Now, in the following chapter, there is a surprise for Elizabeth. Henchard is now a lonely man. He's a desolate man. He has lost his wife, and he has also lost his friendship with Farfrae because of his own kind of foolish jealousy. But Elizabeth Jane treats him very well. She thinks that that Michael Henchard is her real father. As he stands in the need of somebody's affection, he now tells Elizabeth that she is his daughter, real daughter, biological daughter, and not the daughter of Newson. He cannot but restrain himself. He must, and that is what he does here. This information comes as a great surprise to us. After the death of Susan, the curtain is lifted, and she is exposed to the new fact, absolutely unexpected, that this stepfather is not actually the stepfather, but the real father of Elizabeth. She has no reason to doubt Henchard, and Henchard asks her to change her name accordingly, and she agrees to her call, Miss Elizabeth Jane Henchard instead of Elizabeth Jane Newson. But Michael Henchard is a man who goes on receiving shocks one after another. The same night, another incident occurs, which comes as a jolt to him. He finds Susan's letter with a direction that it should not be opened till Elizabeth Jane's marriage day. But as I said, that the envelope was not properly sealed, and he opens the letter and he reads the letter. He finds a shocking disclosure in this letter. He learns that Elizabeth is not his own biological daughter. His daughter, Michael Henchard's daughter, passed away soon after she left her father. This Elizabeth Jane is actually the daughter of Newson. Of course, a poor fellow receives one more jolt to himself, and this is really unbearable at the moment when he has freshly lost his wife, and the last support, Elizabeth Jane, is not quite a support as he thought so. This is irony of fate. This disclosure is a strange trick, which has played upon Henchard. Irony, it's called irony of fate. And Henchard now starts changing. His attitude to Elizabeth Jane, his love for Elizabeth Jane, everything starts changing. His fondness changes. And now the situation has completely altered. Elizabeth Jane is another man's daughter, and it is quite relevant now to Michael Henchard. In this chapter, what do we see? Henchard's changed attitude to Elizabeth. As I have said in the previous chapter, that Henchard now, little by little, changes. He has got now different feelings. When you know that a certain person is not related to you by blood, then of course you cannot have the same affection and the warmth of feeling as perhaps you could have if you knew that the person is somehow connected to you by blood. Therefore, Henchard is indifferent, growing. His indifference is only growing, and Henchard approves of Farfrae's, being close to Elizabeth Jane, because he doesn't like Farfrae. He doesn't like Elizabeth Jane as much as he often did. So he gradually withdraws his objections to Farfrae of meeting Elizabeth Jane, of courtship between Elizabeth Jane and Farfrae. And then in one more event, there are so many events in Hardy's novel. So in one more event, Elizabeth Jane meets Lucetta, a new character. Lucetta, I just said that she was a love of Michael Henchard, but now she has come to Casterbridge, and she is planning to settle there down. Elizabeth is now feeling quite miserable, of course, for quite obvious reasons. She knows that Michael Henchard is not the real father. Mother is gone. She even wishes that she were dead, so that she could join her dead mother. So one day, by a sheer chance, she meets this beautiful lady, Lucetta, who comes to the same grave actually. It's a graveyard, and there they meet. This young lady learns from Elizabeth that Elizabeth is Henchard's daughter, and that Henchard is very, very cruel now. I mean, not as affectionate as he was. Elizabeth, of course, now thinks herself to be Henchard's daughter and not Newson's, though actually she is Newson's daughter. I think this is something. But Elizabeth Jane in this episode, Elizabeth Jane doesn't like Henchard, because Henchard doesn't like Elizabeth Jane. Anyway, so Lucetta and Elizabeth Jane come to each other. Both of them start liking each other, and Lucetta also will see that Lucetta, offers a proposal to Elizabeth Jane to stay with her. And Lucetta's circumstances also change gradually, little by little. She is no other than the same person whom Michael Henchard once loved. So Lucetta has come into the possession of a lot of money of late, which she has inherited from a deceased aunt. And Lucetta now comes to stay at Casterbridge. She has heard that Henchard's wife Susan is gone, and that can mean that Henchard is able to marry her. This is the reason why she is at Casterbridge, and she later on will see how she starts living with Elizabeth Jane. Elizabeth Jane also likes Lucetta's company in the next chapter. So this is the end of our second part 2, in fact, and in the following presentations we will find how things change between Lucetta and Elizabeth Jane, and there are relationships between Farfrae and Lucetta, Farfrae and Elizabeth Jane. There are few more events that actually contribute to the worsening of Henchard's circumstances, and how he finally perishes quite unexpectedly or expectedly, the way you want to interpret it. So that's it for now. Once again, I must thank you for your patience. Bye bye.